Zach is back. It's the Zach Gelb Show on Fox Sports 920 The Jersey.
All right, welcome back in. 416 from the Princeton Orthopedic Associates Studios. This is the Zach Gelb Show, Fox Sports 920 The Jersey. I'll be camping out at the Palestra, the Cathedral of College Basketball, this upcoming weekend. Ivy League tournament, and it's a nice local story with a great local rivalry. Penn and Princeton in the semifinal on Saturday, and really one of the more underappreciated stories in college basketball this year has been the job of Mitch Henderson and what he's done at Princeton. Lost two big players in Hans and Caruso, started out the year 4-6, and now this team has won 17 in a row, and they're looking for two more to punch their ticket to the big dance. And now joining us is a former Princeton player and now does their radio broadcasts as a color analyst, and that is Noah Savage, who's kind enough to hop on board the Zach Gelb Show, Fox Sports 920 The Jersey. Noah, appreciate the time, and how are you?
Hey, Zach, thanks for having me. Doing great. Already did 4 hours of coverage today. All the shoot-arounds on the men's side from the Palestra. The energy down here is great, so, get down here as soon as you can.
The Palestra is the best. Living in Philadelphia and going to college at Temple University, there's nothing like a Big Five game in the Palestra, but you were a part of this Penn-Princeton rivalry, and you got to see it from the Ivy League perspective. When you look back at this rivalry, I know when you were there, you only won one time, and it was in overtime, but what do you remember about your games up against Penn?
Well, the games were always really tough and very physical. They always had really good big guys who would kind of, crash into you the entire game. They kind of played a little bit of bully ball down low, but my time kind of spanned one of the key seasons, which was 2007, where if you draw a line in the Ivy League history from 2007 on, that's when we really are seeing the modern era of the Ivy League, with Cornell going on their run, and then Harvard with 5 straight titles, and then, of course, Yale getting a share of it and then getting into the tournament and beating Baylor last year. But, prior to that, there were only 3 seasons between 59 and 2007 where Penn or Princeton did not share the Ivy League title, at least share the Ivy League title. So really, that was it. It was Penn or Princeton going to the big dance. That's not the case anymore in the Ivy League.
These teams have been playing in the same season since 1903. That's a long time to have two teams playing against each other. Since you were a part of the rivalry, just what does that rivalry mean to you when you walk into a building now and you still see Penn and Princeton playing basketball together?
It's kind of indescribable until you're in it. But it's a mutual respect as much as it is the kind of mutual hatred. So these are guys that, you actually end up being kind of friends with after you're done playing. But while you're there, they're the opposite version of you. I mean, you're so similar, and that's what makes it such a good rivalry is that, sure, there's runs where one side or the other will dominate, but over the history, I mean, they're apart by one, and now they're apart by 2 championships, but it's just sustained excellence. And when you're a Princeton player, you have to respect what Penn has been able to do.
And Noah, as we're talking to Noah Savage right now, former Princeton player, now is their radio analyst for the Princeton Tigers basketball games. Ivy League tournament this weekend, Princeton trying to go back to the NCAA tournament. But when you walk into the Palestra, you just feel the history. And I always call it a museum because I could go there and you could walk around the building and just learn so much about the history of basketball in Philadelphia. The first time you walked into the Palestra, what do you remember, Noah?
Well, it's an old building, and, it's from a player's perspective, it's cold. It's got the great acoustics. It's kind of got the grandstands that go all the way up. It's a little bit darker than other arenas in the gym, or in the league, rather. So you're kind of struck by how you feel like you're part of the history because you could literally be in 1980 or 1960, and the building hasn't changed at all. And that's a big deal. It feels different. The only place I can compare it to is a couple seasons ago, Princeton played at Butler, and Butler's gym was actually built at the time with a bigger capacity than the town had because they anticipated that basketball would grow, and it was built in the 1800s. That's the type of feel it has, and you kind of recognize that you're part of history at that time when you walk in the Palestra.
Let's talk about this Princeton team this year. Like I mentioned in the open, they had to overcome a lot of adversity. How did this team get here to this point where they're 2 wins away from going back to the NCAA tournament?
Right. Well, the story of the season was supposed to be they returned 99% of their scoring, and then they add in Hans Brace, who was probably their second-best player 2 seasons ago. Henry Caruso led the team in scoring last year, but early on they lose both Caruso and Brace to season-ending injuries. So all that they did was Miles Stevens stepped right into Henry Caruso's role and exceeded expectations. He was a first-team All-Ivy League performer this year, and then they got all the contributions they expected out of Steve Cook and Spencer Weiss, who was recently named the Ivy League Player of the Year. But really the key was Miles Stevens stepping in, playing above where anybody probably thought he would be at this point as a sophomore, and he was super consistent, especially in the league games.
When you were at shoot-around this morning, and Princeton's had a few days off before they get ready for the game coming up tomorrow, but we've seen in this conference tournament, we've seen some number 1 seeds make it all the way already and punch their ticket to the big dance, and then we see a team like Monmouth, who won 17 in a row as well, lost in the semifinals, and now they'll be on the outside looking in come Selection Sunday. Is this a loose group right now, or do they feel the pressure a little bit and they're uptight?
They're pretty loose, and it starts with Spencer Weiss. He kind of stepped on campus with the maturity of like a 33-year-old as a freshman. Now that he's a senior, nothing can face him. I think he, along with Steve Cook and also Amir Bell, who accepted a role coming off the bench this season, has done a great job of keeping it loose and keeping it composed. They played in a lot of tight games and important games. And it's interesting, if you look back at Princeton's schedule, the 2 games that kind of set them on this run were a close loss at Monmouth by 6 points. And after that, they beat Bucknell, who's going to be in the tournament on the road, and they haven't lost since that night. And I think the Ivy League wants to head in the direction of being a 2-bid league, but the fact that teams like Monmouth are losing are really going to hurt either, whatever team comes in second in the Ivy League tournament is going to hurt their chances.
You know that there's good coaches in the Ivy, and you guys have the best coach in the Ivy for this season in Mitch Henderson, as he was named Coach of the Year in the Ivy. You see him every night. You see how he coaches at Jadwin Gymnasium and then also on the road, and this is a spectacular coaching job that he's done this year. What makes him such a good coach, being a former player?
Well, I think that the things that he picked this season to focus on have showed up on the court, and when the team has seen success from them, they've even bought in more. For example, they're second to last in the country in fewest fouls overall, and they're among the leaders in not turning it over, as well as assist-to-turnover ratio in the nation. So what they do a really good job of is they guard the three-point line, they contest every pass, they get a ton of steals, they have a bunch of guys who are 6'5" to 6'7" who can switch everything, and he's focused on the right things, where he's letting the team play with some freedom on offense, as long as they buy into the fact that they have to guard the three-point line and contest every pass.
You mentioned the role of Amir Bell and how it changed this year from going to a starter to someone coming off the bench, and he's basically perfected that role in this win streak coming off the bench. How tough was it for Amir to buy in, or did Coach make it pretty easy for him?
Well, Coach let me know. I was like, did you have a conversation with Amir? And he's like, yeah, it was a pretty one-sided conversation, though. So he kind of let him know, like, this is going to be your role, but nothing faces Amir Bell. I mean, he had a huge basket in their win against Harvard at Jadwin a week ago, and he had another couple big ones up at Harvard. But here's a guy who started the season 1 for 24 from the three-point line, and then during Ivy League play, he led the conference at 55%. So he's got an enormous amount of mental toughness to not get down on himself when he wasn't playing as well as he probably can. And he's just been awesome coming off the bench and really attacking mismatches as a 6'5" guard.
And we know one of the better players on this roster is Stephen Cook, but I was looking at the stat lines, and we had Stephen on last week, and he struggled up against Penn this year. Even though you guys got 2 wins up against him, he only has 5 points in those 2 games. What type of Stephen Cook do you think we'll see tomorrow in the Palestra?
I think if he watches some of those tapes, he maybe was just picking the wrong times to drive and shoot. And I think at 6'6", when the ball gets swung to him, if he has any daylight, I expect him to start his game from the outside and really let it fly and force Penn to get up on him before he starts to drive. I think Penn does a good job with a soft closeout where they kind of make you indecisive if you're fully open or not, and just that split section lets them recover. So I expect a big good game out of Cook.
Other than Cook, and we also touched on Amir Bell a little bit, what are the 3 big keys for Princeton and what they have to do tomorrow up against Penn?
One of the keys is going to be to slow down Broder in the post And Princeton's done a good job this year against dominant post players, sending a double team on the catch and on the dribble. And if they can force him into some turnovers, they can get out on the break where they feel comfortable. Spencer Weiss has pretty much taken what the defense has given him all season long. He had a huge game at the Palestra earlier this season with 6 threes, and I think that the rest of the team is going to follow Spencer's lead to see if he's going to be a creator or if he's going to look for his own offense early, and that'll really just rely on what type of defense that Penn plays. The X factor is probably Devin Kennedy because he's had enormous first halves, like 5 3-pointers up at Yale. And when he explodes from beyond the arc, that really takes the pressure off the rest of his team.
Wrapping up with Noah Savage, who's kind enough to join us right now on the Zach Gelb Show, Fox Sports 920, the Jersey. Noah, I was reading an article earlier this morning, and it was actually from a few years ago, and it says you are a comedian as well. How's the comedy career going? Is it still going?
Well, let me answer that with a question. Have you seen me on TV?
No, I haven't. So I guess it's not going too well.
Still going. I haven't quit yet. But I'll tell you what, Zach. The biggest thing I got out of my comedy career, I met my wife, also a comedian. We got married New Year's Eve. But the one strike against her, she's a Harvard lady, so she's got mixed emotions headed into the weekend.
So since you're a funny guy, did you propose in a funny way since it's two comedians?
Oh, no, I'm a sap. I did it in the morning and very romantic, I thought. And the biggest move, I called her work and made sure she'd get a couple days off. So she's probably more excited about that than the actual engagement.
Very good job. So what's like a typical night in stand-up comedy, if you had to describe it to me? Like, what's your routine, kind of?
Well, in New York, you go out. If you're not on the show, you're going to do 2 or 3 open mics that are other comedians to test out your material. Try to go to and watch some other shows, see if you can get on them in the future weeks. It's incredibly competitive. There's a line of, 30 men and women, vying for 5 or 6 spots in a given night at a club. But it's also kind of a small world. It's a little bit similar to basketball where, once you're a player, you kind of get that respect, even if you're not necessarily doing it on the national stage yet.
Yeah, but here's the thing. When basketball, let's say when you have a bad night, and let's say you airball a few shots, you walk back into the locker room and do it all over the next day, and maybe you'll get some mean tweets. But what happens when you bomb it in comedy? The hellacious boos in person must be worse than the hellacious boos in a basketball court, right?
Come on, you don't think I heard those boos at the Palestra as a player, or signs that say Savage has a face for radio, or going 1 for 12 where I made my first shot on ESPN2 against Wake Forest? I mean, that's the ultimate bomb, and that one you're letting other people down too. So that's much worse, in my opinion. Come on, bombing on stage, that's great. That's a great moment. That's hilarious.
No, before we let you go, when you're at the free throw line, you always have fans trying to distract you. Do you notice what the fans are doing, or are you just in a zone mentally at the free throw line where you block it out?
I wish I noticed more. I think that it's an interesting question because you've got personality types that vary, where I think a guy like Spencer Weiss is listening to the crowd, thinks it's funny, gets a kick out of it, and is able to perform. I was such a pressure ball that I probably blocked everything out, but if going back, I wish I could have loosened it up. I mean, I remember one particular heckle at Harvard where someone said something about my sister, and I was like, man, they went deep to figure out what she was up to, and I was like, all right, I'm just impressed with the research. That's
a good job out of them. Noah Savage, great job out of you as always. We appreciate it. We'll see you tomorrow, and thanks so much.
All right, thanks a lot, Zach.